all three panelists for really fascinating papers, and especially to our São Paulo participants coming from USP, coming to Chicago. We didn't order cold weather, but although these papers are very different, focusing even on different time periods, I wanted to briefly bring them together by discussing two of the overlapping themes that run through all three papers in different ways. Spatial change, the reconceptualization of space and development, and to the importance of local and global networks. In terms of the former, the three papers examined both the physical changes in space and place, with Heitor focusing on the Luz district in the center of São Paulo, Derek focusing on Jardim Bandeirantes in the southeast, and Camilla focusing on spatial changes within houses in wealthier neighborhoods such as Sumaré. Each of the papers analyzed spatial changes in different ways, but all focus on the impact of these changes on the inhabitants, as well as seeing the inhabitants as agents, although sometimes as weak agents in these changes. Through their papers, we can also visualize these spaces, as they all vividly portray these spaces through descriptive language and the voices of the inhabitants in some cases. As a caveat, to better understand where my comments are coming from, I wanted to tell you that I've been trained as an urban planner in the United States, where architecture and planning was very separate. And worked before going back to academia in international economic development with NGOs and the United Nations. In her paper, Camilla refers to these separations within Brazilian architecture field, for example, separating them from engineering. In the United States, there's even further separation, I should say. So, in terms of examining the Luz district, also known as Cracolândia, Heitor analyzes a variety of different spaces within this nebulously defined place, including buildings, clubs, and the streets, and the larger, newest threat of major changes with the new urban project launched by the City Hall of the municipality of São Paulo called Nova Luz. Heitor's paper therefore focuses on how both this threat as well as the daily threats of violence and illegal activities influence the daily lives within this district and the spatial changes. However, Heitor gets way beyond the coverage in the press, getting at the intricacies of these spaces within this district. So-called development of this space has not come from the users of these spaces, nor reflects the positive interactions and uses of this space. He sees the district far from a fixed space, but is ever evolving with no established boundaries of Luz, being redefined by various public programs. It is a space that has always been characterized by the popular occupation of its public spaces. For example, between the 60s and 80s, Heitor remarks that it became a place for a criminal cinema, the production of pornographic and erotic movies. This he does in the paper, not here. Since the 90s, empty buildings have been occupied by squatters. The uses of this space, however, continues to be extremely heterogeneous. As an aside, Derek in his paper says that he will open it with a vignette, and I completely agree with Derek that that's a good way to start things. So Derek examines how these so-called marginal spaces and neighborhoods, and especially the narratives about them, have changed because of marginal art forms and practice in the sense that discourses of periphery identity are foregrounded in new cultural and entertainment institutions such as A Casa and Diadema and Sarao open mic circuits. Derek clearly argues that local folk are the owners of these spaces and continue to have a sense of obligation to space, with location being, as he says, the raison d'être of both hip-hop and sarao. Development of these spaces, unlike in the case of the Loose District, has been, and I quote from him, turned on its head in the name of public participation. His critique of the word development is crucial for our analysis of São Paulo, arguing that so-called development is a form of socioeconomic order guided by universal reason and a rationality of efficiency and production. That's how it's been argued. As Derek writes, quote, "The movements of hip-hop made manifest in the hip-hop house, along with the saraos made manifest in the multiple hole-in-the-wall bars scattered about Southside São Paulo, offer a contrast to the architectural spectacles, as he showed then of the bridge and the new, which he calls the new postcard of urban infrastructure." Yes, most of the postcards have that on there now. Or the cleansing campaigns to develop the decadent downtown section known as Cracolândia. The difference is not only in terms of material investment and political posturing, however, he argues, is about a more directed attention at participatory planning. Camilla Rosati, in examining the work of the architect Villanova Artigas in the 40s and 50s, examines two different aspects of space and place, many more, but two that I'll talk about. That of the changes in the physical layout of houses from large to smaller private bedrooms and more common space, and joined the kitchen with the dining room in one case, changing the whole conceptualization of middle-class spaces, for example, and the differences between the architectural theories of space and practices between Rio and São Paulo at the time. However, it was the relationships and the networks that encouraged these changes. The agents of these changes were the architects in this case, influenced by architectural trends in the United States and Europe. So I go then to these local and global networks, the new theme. And I'd like to briefly explore this with you, looking at first continuing with Camilla's work and then going to the others. So continuing with Camilla's work, the outside influences and the agents of these changes were both international architectural movements, but also national political influences, both in whom the clients were of Artigas and his designs. Artigas entered into the debates of the Communist Party, frequenting left circles, and was part of political struggles. He not only then built houses for others in these political movements, such as workers' rights lawyers Rio Branco Paranhos and Rivadavia Mendonça in Macambu, but he also thought that his architecture could change the thoughts and actions of the bourgeoisie. Both of the houses for the labor rights lawyers were influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, with large windows, fluid inner environment, diverse building materials ranging from wood, tile, stone, and not concrete, contrasting with the modern architecture of Rio. Both local and global networks and intellectual and design ideas that came out of them were crucial for Artigas. Jumping to this new millennium, we see the same global and local networks and ideas being critical to the changes in daily lives in both the Luz district and the low-income neighborhoods in the southeast of São Paulo. We get the influences of global neoliberal urbanism in the Luz district with the idea of development being to wipe out the old and make room for the private investors. And in the case of the southeast neighborhoods, we get the global influence of hip-hop. Yet the very local influences within the music itself and the fact that its production and performance remains in the neighborhoods, with more elite young people going out to these neighborhoods when they never would have done this before. The networks, therefore, have widened with external funding and a wider audience. Although Derek and Camilla's papers speak to the issue of the importance of different kinds of networks, the paper on Luz by Hector particularly focuses on the interconnections between different social actors within Cracolândia. Through ethnographic detail about his interviews with various actors within this space, building managers, a store of musical instruments, a bar and a restaurant, the Centro do Samba, and other social actors such as crack users, people living in the buildings, and Bolivians, we begin to see these interconnections, whether it is just passing by and saying hi to crack users, or whether it's a closer connection of one building manager whose relationships were with a user of crack who he had even taken into his house for a short time, but came into conflict then with people who lived in the building, who were connected to informal commerce, and then he found out that a group in his building has been, quote, simultaneously exploiting the trade in pirated goods and trafficking cocaine using the building as its base. He had already left the building before finding this out because of incidents of physical aggression. One woman living in the second building studied had even more relationships with other social actors. She makes sweets and savories to order and walks through the area delivering orders, going to the children, the supermarket, lottery store, bakery, and visiting friends. She's also interacted with users of crack, exchanging words with them, and sometimes giving them a bit of money. And I recognize I had the longer bit, so you didn't see some of these interactions going on. The social actors all have in common the, quote, desire to use the advantages of the central location, proximity to, and opportunities of work, including informal work, services, and urban equipment. This paper allows us to go beyond the polarized dichotomy, the opposition between Nova Luz, revitalization in Cracolândia, and degradation. However, I would like to have read and heard much more, for example, of their observations for example, on the streets. And Hector tells us about that these interactions and these observations then allowed him to gradually understand the relations among users and between users and the other agents. And for example, the agents of some of these NGOs working there, like the Group for Women, Ethics and Freedom, the Group for Marginalized Women, which act in the streets with sex professionals, and the Baptist Church with their rehabilitation of users so they can work taking place in this space they call Cristolândia. One of the problems has been that recent actions in the areas of health but connected to the more comprehensive plan of this Nova Luz has affected the way others attending the users of crack have been able to work with and interact with the users he talks about. Petar, however, does not sugarcoat that all the relationships have been simply people nicely interacting with each other, but has brought up issues of homicides, threats, violence, causing the researchers at times to leave one of the buildings where a building administrator had been murdered because of using privileged information to buy and sell apartments in the building. Other interactions happened because of the threats of Nova Luz project, like he told us, such as the owner of the bar Contemporánea, which sells also musical instruments, and he has become involved then with a group of storekeepers, he describes, who started to oppose the project. I would like to know a lot more about that and how not only that he was able to benefit from getting then the workers to come to his restaurant, but those interactions now with different actors that he didn't have access to before. So I would like now to turn the further discussion to the audience for you to ask questions. I have a lot more specific questions, but I know that we're running a little bit late, so I'll ask them if there's time, but I'd like to open it up to you to ask your questions.